Welcome everyone to the Active Archive Alliance Cloud Data Repatriation webinar. Today, Paul Lupino of Iron Mountain, Philip Story from XenData, and myself, Sean Bermay from IBM, will be taking you through some of the use cases and modern strategies around data growth challenges. One of these is including cloud data repatriation. First, a little bit about the Active Archive Alliance. The Alliance was founded in April of 2010. It is a collaborative education with many companies participating. It was designed to promote simplified online access to all data throughout its life related to archiving client data, personal data, and regulatory data. We align these sessions around education technologies that meet the evolving requirements related to data archiving. With our three presenters, today's agenda will include cloud storage, covering some of the hidden costs which haven't or aren't easily accessible, why companies are repatriating data, how companies are moving that data out of the cloud back onto premise, and hybrid use cases, as well as some of the tape use cases that are transforming the industry. Before we get started with our agenda, I'd like to let each presenter do a small introduction of themselves. Let's start out with Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Sean. It's Paul Lupino. I've been with Iron Mountain almost 18 years, and I am responsible for its data management business.
And Philip Story.
Hi. I'm the CEO and one of the two founders of XenData. We have been focused on archive solutions for 2 decades now, and got a lot of installations, and I'm going to be talking about a couple of use cases.
And I'm Sean Bermay, tape evangelist and strategist for the tape team here at IBM. Let's get started. The amazing thing around cloud storage is that we often focus around the cost to store the data, but there are many other costs involved. And some of those costs, although not hidden, are not readily accountable within the system of determining whether cloud is a great choice or not. I am not anti-cloud. As a matter of fact, hybrid is necessary to support all of the business needs that we have today. However, it's very important to make sure that the use case matches the storage equivalent. One of the most technical and innovative organizations in the world, NASA, sent individuals to the moon and brought them back, but ended up significantly over budget after not taking into account the amount of not really repatriation, but what could be called recalling data and bring it back on premise for processing. The focus of the group originally was to store up to 247 petabytes or more of data into AWS Glacier. But they forgot that every time they recalled data and brought it back onto premise where they do most of their compute structures, which includes analytics, data analysis from past missions, that they would end up incurring costs. And those costs ended up pushing their budget to over 3 times the original estimate. And that resulted in a price structure of around $308 million over the original budget estimate. So it's very important to take these costs into account as you're looking at storage that's in the cloud. And this really goes to the 5 reasons why organizations are repatriating data. They're finding that the cost to store data, especially long-term active archives where they may have a significant amount of data that's rarely touched. Security and regulatory compliance, latency and data gravity. What is data gravity? Data gravity is the fact that Once you have data, you're going to keep it in a location. But because cloud migrations can be very difficult to get data to the cloud and expensive, many have found that they're stopping their original intent to push data out because they just can't get it there. And ultimately, they're finding that when they need data, providers, cloud providers, are seeing failures at the same time they need data because the burden across the organization is the same. And as a result, 94% of IT professionals indicate that cloud storage costs are continuing to rise, not just because of the amount of data, but also because the method in which data is being used. More old data is being recalled, even though it's not all at the same time. And here's one example, an open example from Hey.com. Not a large example, but an excellent methodology. Indicated that when they started their transformation journey to bring compute and data back from the cloud, they were worried they were going to incur a lot more cost per month when they broke it down to get the data from cloud to premise. However, as you can see from left to right, what they actually saw was as they brought their compute back on premise, they were able to draw down the amount of usage in cloud at the same time. And the entire time they could pull back data and reduce those costs. And by midway through their journey, they were already seeing around 20% savings per month, bringing back on-premise for both compute and storage. This is a great example of why cloud repatriation of data as well as compute is really being a heavy consideration for organizations at this time. Now I want to turn it over to Philip for some examples. Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I want to describe a couple of XenData customer examples. I'm going to describe one, which is the one for this slide here for its life sciences company organization. And the other is a large customer in the media and entertainment space. With this first life sciences example, the customer had 10 petabytes in Azure in the lowest cost tier. That was to keep their monthly costs down. That lowest cost tier is the archive tier. This organization had 10 petabytes, but it was growing fast. Even at the 10 petabyte level, the annual subscription cost was about $100,000 a year. And the organization came to realize that LTO was a much better way to go. They purchased the 2.7 petabytes XenData LTO9 archive system at a cost of about $80,000. And as with all XenData systems, this supports an unlimited number of externalized LTO cartridges. Their intention was to use the 2.7 petabyte library to hold content that was most frequently accessed and to keep the rest offline. The files stored on LTO cartridges in the library, they have an access time of about 2 minutes. And the offline content, of course, needs a human operator to select the needed cartridges, which are there on the shelf, and import them back into the library. This compares with a previous situation that took from 1 hour to 15 hours to restore content from Azure archive tier. But the biggest driver for this customer was cost. It wasn't the performance, even though they get better performance, certainly, for that content in the library. 100K every year and growing for the cloud option compares with an initial investment of 80K for the LTO system, plus the cost of LTO cartridges at about $55,000 for 10 petabytes of cartridges. To make this transition, the customer knew that they had to bite the bullet when it came to fees to restore their own data from cloud. There were two types of fees that were of concern: egress fees and rehydration fees. Egress is the cost to migrate files out of the cloud provider's ecosystem. And when performing a complete migration, there are ways to get around this. So the biggest concern was the other cost, the rehydration cost. And there is no way around them. These are the costs to move files from an inaccessible tier to an accessible tier of storage, so you can actually get at them. And in this case, the cost to rehydrate 10 petabytes is, wait for it, $400,000. So this company knew they had to move off of cloud. It was just cost prohibitive. But they also knew that they had to bite the bullets and pay that huge fee to get their content back. But they're now in a situation where they have a much more affordable solution. This is also a great example of its case study that basically says, well, if you are a user and you're going to put a lot of data into tiered public cloud, then it's a really good idea to be somewhat hybrid and to keep a copy of that content on-prem. Because one year or another, you are going to have to move. And the cost is extremely expensive when you want to move from your cloud, from your tiered storage cloud provider. Next slide, please. This second example is the Hollywood studio. They've been a XenData LTO customer for about 10 years. The operations team was requested by senior management to evaluate moving their 4 petabytes of content to the AWS cloud. To keep costs reasonable, the only AWS option was Deep Glacier, which has an access time of about 12 hours. Even at this storage tier, the lowest cost, the annual cost was still higher than that of an LTO system. But it seemed like the customer organization could find the extra annual funds to make this transition. However, the customer decided that they had to stay with LTO for performance reasons. The operations team knew that their users were happy with the access time from LTO. They stored all of their content within an LTO library, unlike my previous example. So all 4 petabytes were in a library, and the users simply restored files over the network, and they'd gotten used to waiting for about 2 minutes before the file transfers started. The Deep Glacier alternative would involve the users initiating a rehydration of the required files and then waiting for about 12 hours before they were then available for download. This would have been a major deterioration of performance and would likely result in lots of internal support calls with users frustrated by the delays. So in summary, this example is not a repatriation per se, but it illustrates the benefits of LTO on-prem when dealing with petabytes of long-term storage. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Philip. Those are great use cases. Now we're going to hear from Paul from Iron Mountain. And as most of us know, Iron Mountain is really the de facto around archiving data. Paul, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. So, and I would encourage my colleagues here to jump in if you've got a particular point you'd like to make during the conversational piece of this. But what I would say is the trends I'll just keep it high level for this conversation. The trends we're seeing and sort of what's driving is obviously cost related, which we've talked about earlier. What we typically see is every 5 years or so, companies change, for example, their backup software because they want the new, shiny object, the new features, the ransomware prevention, or whatever other thing that's driving them, and they're left with a legacy system with data that usually has to be kept for some period of time, and they have to figure out what they want to do with it, right? And I think a lot of people say, "Gee, I never plan to touch this. What's the cheapest way I can store it?" Right? And I think everybody here knows tape is still the cheapest way to store large volumes of data. The question always comes up about the infrastructure used to access that, but tape itself as a storage medium is certainly the cheapest thing. So I think as people change their software, every 5 years or so, they've orphaned some data, and it turns out they were no better than 10, 20 years ago when we told folks, hey, you should organize your data and tier your data and figure out where right data on the right tier for the right, most cost effective, plan. They never really took that suggestion to light, and they're created the same problem in the cloud, right? And so we have customers come to ask us, can you rent us a tape library so we can actually create a final cut of this data onto tape and then stick it in our Mountain Vault, as an example. So some folks are realizing that the air gap requirement needs are maybe not quite as as slick as some of the cloud providers have suggested, and they want that physical break glass in case of emergency, tape basically. And I think that the idea of using a single provider for everything, when I think people 5 years ago started moving data to the cloud and just assumed it was backed up and protected, and I've realized that's not so much the case, right? And so figuring out how to not keep all your eggs in one basket is sort of the other trend we're seeing people start to do these days.
Paul, that last one, it definitely rings true. Over the last few months, there's been several high profile cases of cloud providers losing entire instances and ultimately the user having to go to a different cloud or their secondary backup. One of the things I've seen in trends that relates directly to what you were saying was, it doesn't matter what type of data. Originally, we had specific ISVs and clients were moving from ISV to ISV. We're seeing more and more of that data going into unstructured categories like file systems and especially object storage. And as object storage, a lot of customers look at the cloud and say, well, this is where I can put my data. And then they start doing the numbers and they say, well, yeah, it's a little less expensive to be on premise with tape. But what gets them is what Philip brought forward. And that is, okay, it's a little less expensive, but where I really benefit is I would have to compare to something like a Glacier flexible retrieval to get my performance that I get out of tape on premise. Now, if you have a storm, tape could be slower as well, but that is a great example of how data placement is so important. Philip, anything from you?
Just to add, just to reinforce the point I was making earlier, really, it's reducing the reliance on a single provider. And if you're putting hundreds of terabytes into the cloud, then having your own copy, just by having a system that puts a copy on LTO, the lowest cost option, that then means that when that day comes, when you're going to want to move the data to a different cloud provider, or maybe you only have a small cloud provider and they go out of business, you have your own copy, and I think that's so important. It's interesting. Another example. In Malaysia, the government is funding. That's called Cloud First. They're funding lots of companies to put content into the cloud. Great. But when that funding stops, a lot of companies will want to repatriate because they won't be able to afford the fees. So having your own copy on-prem is so important.
Great. 3, 2, 1 in 1. It goes back to having multiple copies in multiple places, and that includes on-premise and in the cloud. That was a great session. Thank you very much. If you're looking for more information, you can reach out to any of the participants of the Active Archive Alliance. They're happy to help you, or you can reach directly to the Active Archive Alliance website. From me, Sean Brumet, Paul Lupino from Iron Mountain, Philip Story from XenData, thank you very much.